Hello and welcome back to North 100, a Canadian Highlander podcast. I'm Liam, and joining me today is Jeremy. Serge was supposed to be here, but GP Vegas was
too much for his sweet voice.
That's correct. Yes, that's the problem he had.
GP Vegas 1, Serge's voice 0.
Yeah, but Serge will be back next week. This time we swear. I think. I don't know. He might still be. We'll figure it out when we get there. Before we start today's show, I just want to make a quick reminder that everything that we do here on the Loading Ready Run video network is brought to you by you over at patreon.com/loadingreadyrun. So thanks so much for your support there. We really couldn't do it without you. And without further ado, let's get into today's show. Jared, hit me up with the best card you're not playing, our first opening segment that we primarily talk about in the beginning.
Yeah. So I have a sweet one, Arks Lager. For those of you who play
the sloggy dog,
play Commander, you might have died to this once or a million times. So this card is good in a few decks in Canadian. I'll say what it does first. How about that? It's 3 red for a 4/5 beast, and it has an activated ability.
Type line.
Pay a red. But it's a gray red because it's from Mirrodin. This is important.
Of course.
Before
we figured out coloring mana symbols.
They didn't make it a red. It was gray because it was an artifact block. Pay a red. Remove the top 10 cards of your library from the game. Arks Lager deals 2 damage to target creature or player. So this is... You may be thinking that removing the top 10 cards of your library from the game is bad. And it sometimes it is. But when you have, 80 of them, that's 16 damage. That's them dead most of the time.
Or their entire board, and then this kills them.
Yeah, either or. But in 100-card singleton formats, this card is extremely powerful just because of the number of activations you get out of it. It's primarily played in either Big Red or Big Red X decks, just because you can ramp into it very quickly and often have an excess of red mana just lying around.
I've seen someone Eldritch Evolution for Arks Lager before.
Yeah, that's where I was going. The other decks you often see this in is red-green, sometimes red-green X decks, where you can, Eldritch Evolution your Kitchen Finks into this, and then you're just, threatening to either kill anything they play or just presenting a ridiculously fast clock.
I did once Zealous Conscripts, my opponent's Arks Lager, and then killed him with it.
That's pretty savage.
Yeah, in my Abzan pod deck, it was good. I don't know how I had 3 red hanging out, but yeah, we did. It was the Kiki Jiki that I needed to cast that I was fetching for. But it turned out to be useful for another reason.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, sweet. That's a good card.
This is a sweet budget win con if you're looking for one.
That's true, very cheap.
Yeah, often you get some heads turned when you first put this into play, but they often turn back when they die to it. So.
Yeah. People are like, Arks Lager, and then 2 turns later, they're like, I just could never beat Arks Lager.
Yeah.
Turns out that card's unbeatable.
5 toughness makes it very difficult to remove.
Yeah.
Just very good. It's also super flavorful. It looks like it's just ready to fire off like 16 shocks.
You know what? I believe you.
Yeah.
We just slog through some boards.
All right.
So
today's show.
Yeah, moving on. So today what we're talking about is card evaluation. And we do a bunch of card evaluation on the show. We have a bunch of set reviews. We talk about cards often. But what we wanted to do was to give you, the viewer, some tools for evaluating cards in specifically the Canadian Highlander format context. Because obviously many of us are comfortable with evaluating cards in formats that we have played a lot or can watch a lot of content for, but obviously with Highlander there's less, and so we want to give you more information and try and give you a leg up on that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about different methodologies that we employ in order to evaluate cards, and then from there we're going to look at some examples of cards that the community missed, that we just evaluated wrong, didn't think were very good, but ended up being insane. Cards that the community was very split on, and we'll talk about whether they were good or not and why. And then we're going to talk about cards that the community immediately identified as not so great and lived up to that billing. And we're going to use those examples to really elucidate the methodology that we're going to explain first. So let's start with the methodology. When we're going to evaluate a card, Jared, what are the things we need to look at?
See. First, you need to look at it in terms of, like, does it work in the speed of the format? Canadian Highlander's a relatively fast format. You're thinking turn 4/5 not unreasonable. I think it's like a turn 4.5 format is usually what we agreed upon. If most of the quicker decks get to Goldfish, they're killing you in turn 4, turn 5. So when you look at a card in terms of Canadian Highlander, the first thing you have to look at is, does it affect games quickly? Like, not many 7-drops are gonna be making the cut. So first thing you want to look at is mana cost. The next thing you want to look at is, does it fit into any specific archetype? That's something that's sort of harder to do, and that's often where a lot of the community mistakes happen, is they don't necessarily look at a card within the context of a given archetype, and we'll
and you might just not know that archetype exists or what have you.
Touch more on that later. And do you want to help me out?
Yeah, sure. Lastly, we want to look at how widely useful the card is. So obviously it's oftentimes very easy to see the best use case of a card, but you also want to look at the worst use case, and most importantly, you want to look at what the average use case is going to be. And again, this is something that can be difficult without having context, without playing a lot of the format, but we're gonna try and shed some light on ways that you can imagine how cards might play out.
And especially with the last point that Liam brought up, sometimes it can vary. Sometimes a card has a very good average case, like pretty reasonable best case, but the worst case is just so bad that you probably can't consider it too often. And other times it's the opposite. Sometimes a card will have a really, really terrible worst case, like also ran average case, but then the best case is just so good that sometimes it's worth sticking it in your deck.
Yeah. So let's start with some examples, right? Let's start with an example right away to give you an idea. And we're going to talk about a card that we really missed and talk about why it is we missed. So we're going to talk about the Scarab God. And this is actually a card that Jared's talked about as the best card you're not playing before. But if you go look, when Jared and I did an Amonkhet set review, it's on YouTube. Did we talk about this card at all? I'm not sure we even. Sorry, it was Hour of Devastation.
I think this was the one that we recorded and maybe never.
And we never made it online.
But
anyway, we didn't talk about this card very much.
No, we talked about it maybe in terms of a zombie tribal deck. If it went Esper, like, we didn't really see it as the powerhouse mid-range card that it turned out to be.
It turns out this is not a synergy card.
No, not really. Even though it sometimes looks at it, it says zombie a lot on the card. It cares how many zombies you card, but it turns out it's just a self-fueled game-ending monster.
Engine. Yeah. And so let's talk about where the failings happened here. One, we didn't actually look hard enough at the best-case scenario. We looked at maybe we were too linear even in what we looked at as the best case scenario. We thought like, oh, you have a bunch of zombies in play, then this triggers, that's really effective.
Yeah.
But we didn't look at like getting to that situation, or maybe even what the average case was as much.
Well, I think we got sort of too stuck on, we sort of pigeonholed it. We did the opposite of what I talked about earlier, in that we placed it into an archetype and assumed that would be the place that we saw it. And it's not a very widely played archetype, and it might be good in that deck, but we didn't consider it outside of that. And I think that's where we sort of fell flat there, is that we sort of pigeonholed it, put it into a deck, and didn't consider it outside of that deck.
The other thing that's misleading about this card is the mana cost. 5 is a lot, and this card doesn't obviously affect the board when it comes into play. Like, yes, it's a 5/5, but that's often irrelevant by turn 5, right? Like a 5/5 is often not enough, and tapping out in a blue and black deck didn't feel like a thing that you could really do. And I think what really sort of works against the fact that this is a 5/5, or that this costs 5 mana, is that the decks you would play it in can naturally slow the game down. And they're looking to extend the game past that turn 4 or 5 that we're talking about, which makes this card a lot more playable.
Yeah, and it's just got a bunch of great text on it that also helps with its 5 mana cost. It's like, unlike other 5 mana spells in Highlander where you really want them to come in and have either an enter the battlefield ability or have haste or something like that, that's where its last ability comes in. Like, the reason you want your things to have value when they come in is because if your opponent just untaps and removes them, at least you got some value out of them. But this does that just in a unusual way. This text hasn't been printed very often. You just get it back.
Yeah.
And then you get to do it all over again.
And so really quickly, for our viewers who might not know what the Scarab God does, it's a 3 blue black legendary creature god that at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. For 2 blue and a black, you can exile a creature from a graveyard and create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 zombie. And then when it dies, you return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So it's a resilient threat that is, as we said, a sort of self-fueling engine.
And one thing that's super relevant is that it targets any graveyard. So the chances are that you're getting a really, really high impact creature are much higher.
Yep. And since you're in black, you're going to be killing a lot of creatures anyway.
You're in blue, you're going to be countering creature spells.
Yeah.
Like,
so what are the lessons we can maybe take away from our miss on Scarab God? What are things we can look to do better in evaluating future cards that we learned from this one?
So one thing I think, the biggest thing I think we did here when we missed was that we pigeonholed the deck and didn't look at it, pigeonholed the card into a deck and didn't look at it broadly enough. I think that you have to do both. You have to look at it sort of generally and try to put it into a context of a deck as best you can, and you're not going to hit it perfectly 100% of the time. But when you're looking at a card, it's important to look at it both like sort of in a vacuum by itself and in context of a deck. And I think we just missed doing the former.
Fair enough. All right, so from a card we missed on, let's talk about when everything lines up and we get a card right. And you might look at these and think that these are obvious, and to a certain extent they are, but that's the point of this episode, is to sort of like look at cards that are obvious for information that will help you evaluate the slightly harder to evaluate cards.
Yeah.
So the card we're going to talk about here, this is Fatal Push. This is also, the scourge of standard around everywhere. So this is a single black instant that says destroy target creature if it has converted mana cost 2 or less, or with Revolt, you can destroy that creature if it has converted mana cost 4 or less instead, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn. So, I mean, when this got spoiled, everyone said it's Black Lightning Bolt, basically, right?
Yeah, or Black Path to Exile is
Right.
another really good comparison I've seen. So part of the reason this card is so powerful is because most of the creatures in Highlander are low CMC, especially the ones you want to kill early, because as we talked about earlier, the speed of the format is just such that you need to be playing lower CMC creatures. You're not going to have time to start at 5.
Yeah.
It also has fetch lands. It's a fetch land format, so the Revolt is very an accessible part of this card. Like, you're often going to be able to cast it with Revolt active. There's lots of other ways you can have it too, like Sensei's Divining Top is legal in the format. You can flip your top, Fatal Push their 4-drop, get a nice rhyme going.
Yeah. And just the mana efficiency of this card is another thing that screams Highlander playable.
Yeah. The ability to trade 1 mana at instant speed for 4 of their mana.
Yeah, is like absolutely insane. And then lastly, it was really easy to envision this slotting into decks, right? Basically any black deck playing removal spells took out whatever their worst removal spell was and put this in instead, because this was just so obviously the new best black removal spell.
And at the time, actually, this was one of the biggest things black was lacking in Highlander. People were playing cards like Vendetta, which is 1 black, destroy target non-black creature, you lose life equal to its toughness. People were playing stuff like Ghastly Demise, destroy target non-black creature if its toughness is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard.
Yep.
Yes. People were playing like Disfigure. Even some people were playing, which is give target creature -2/2. Some people were even playing Ulcerate, which is give target creature -3/3, and you lost 3 life.
Yeah, this is Black Lightning Helix.
All right.
Tell me I'm wrong.
You are.
Okay.
Yeah, so this was something that people had been really a void that people have been really trying to fill over the years with some cards that like just weren't strong enough to do so, and then they finally printed this card and everyone was relieved. There was much rejoicing.
The kingdom was saved.
Yeah.
And so what's the takeaway here? Obviously, where it's a hit, there's not necessarily a lesson to be learned, but when you're looking at this card, it just screams. It just hits all those categories we described so obviously, right? It fits the speed of the format perfectly. It fills voids in existing decks, and then it's just like the worst case scenarios, they don't have a target for it, which means the board is clear.
Yeah, which isn't terrible. Like, it is a removal spell that doesn't have like cycling
yeah.
or a way to turn it into a useful card when they don't have creatures. So like that is the only downside, but just due to the nature of the format, you have to play removal spells in most of your decks.
Yeah.
And there are decks that play like literally only like 1 or 2 removal spells, and this is often one of the ones they play. Like in hard dedicated combo decks that they're like, I want a way to get rid of like Deathrite Shaman, Scavenging Youth, Thalia. This is often the first one that goes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we talked about a miss. We talked about a hit. Now we're going to talk about one that is much harder to evaluate because we don't even know, its status in the format is still up in the air. So the card we're going to talk about here is Censor. And so this is 1 and a blue for an instant that says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. And then for a single blue, you can cycle it. And this was a card that had very mixed reviews when it got spoiled. Some people thought it was like just miscalculation number 2 or like better miscalculation, which for the same mana cost counters the spell unless they pay 2 and will cycle for 2 generic mana instead of a blue mana. And some people said this card's unplayable because it only force spikes for a single mana. Force spike is just single blue counter spell unless you pay 1.
Yeah.
And some people said, well, the fact that this cycles is nuts. There's a lot of parts of this card to unpack. The counterspell aspect's less powerful, the utility's higher.
It looks super simple, but it's actually really hard to evaluate effectively. And I think my read on this card was it was always a meta card. It really depends on what the rest of your deck looked like. Like if your deck was super, super low to the ground and could force them to interact and had like lots of sort of other ways to cover the shortcomings of this card. Like if you had like, I think this card is great in Jeskai, for example. Like you have lots of 2 mana removal spells, you have lots of other 2 mana counter spells, and so it's relatively easy for you to set up a turn where Censor answers their card, or in the late game when you draw Censor, you can cycle it away to try to find a more powerful card. But in other decks where like you really need your 2 mana counter spells to counter their thing on 2, like you're not as good at clearing up the board, you don't have the red removal.
Like this card felt horrendous in control decks to me.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. Because if on turn 3 they just play a 2-drop that you really want to counter, it just feels so bad and you potentially just lose the game.
Yeah.
So I'm still not super sold in this card. I've played it in some decks. I definitely won't play it in control, but
yeah,
I do like it in decks like maybe like Esper midrange, like Jeskai midrange, Jeskai control, where you're definitely able to leverage the downside of this card and like sort of hide the downside and leverage the
upside.
The upside.
Yeah, and so one of the awkward things when we're talking about sort of these 3 categories we laid out, Censor definitely fits in existing decks. There's not necessarily a void for counter spells, but decks want 2 mana counter spells. Like that's a thing that decks want access to.
There are decks that definitely still play 3 mana counter spells, and if they had the choice, they would all be 2 mana instead.
And like the best case, worst case scenario, and average case with Censor is pretty reasonable because of the cycling. Best case you tag something on turn 2. Worst case you draw it very late in the game when it's not doing anything, and it cycles.
And the cycling for 1 mana is
really nice
such a
too.
Huge deal because you're often able to do something the same turn you cycle it, whereas miscalc you're often holding it up as a counter spell, and if it doesn't counter their thing, you're cycling it, and they still have their thing in play, you probably don't get to interact with it at all.
Yeah.
Whereas if you like on turn 3 they play their 2-drop, you cycle, you hit a burn spell, you can still burn their 2-drop with like your lightning strike or whatever it is you cycled into.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why this card is so hard to evaluate is when I sort of think about what's the average use case for Censor, that's where the issue comes from, because it's a card with very high highs or with like reasonably high highs and not that low lows, but low enough. Like if I just wanted a card that cycled for blue in my deck, I'd play something else. I would play an actual cantrip. I'd play Peak or something. So it's like, it's obviously complicated. And then what's the average case? Like how often does Censor actually tag something? How often you end up with a Censor in your hand that you can't cycle for a couple of turns, or that feels awkward to cycle? That makes it hard to evaluate. And then I think ultimately the thing that makes Censor the hardest to evaluate is where it fits in the speed of the format for that same reason. Because on the play it's very good, but on the draw it can be really awkward.
Definitely. It's a lot like It's a lot like Daze in that respect. I actually think Force Spike is still very, very good on the draw in this format. The chances that your opponent's tapping out on turn 2 to play a 2-drop and you just get to out-tempo them with Force Spike is huge.
Yeah, I don't think so, but you know.
But yeah, Censor can be super off.
It's the flavor text. I don't think so. It's not italicized for some reason. Unclear why.
I think it's italicized.
The think is not.
Because it's emphasis. It's I don't think so.
Right. But like,
Okay.
So
it just seems like a weird word to emphasize.
It would be italicized, but because the whole thing is italicized. They do this sometimes in flavor text. Because flavor text is italicized, if they want to emphasize one word, then they un-italicize it.
Yeah.
TIL.
I mean, I guess I understand the formatting. It's more just like
You think it
creative.
should be don't? Like, I don't think so?
I just don't know. It's flavor
I think it
text.
depends on your deliveries. I
Yeah.
don't think so.
I almost think, yeah.
You just wouldn't have done any emphasis at all.
I'm not sure. I'm not a flavor text writer for obvious reasons.
This will be a matter of debate for many years.
Truly,
It probably has.
the battle has raged longer than you could possibly know, Graham.
Why so many questions?
That's a great one.
Is the flavor text uncensored?
Yeah, by Temet, Vizier of
Noctamoon.
Noctamoon. Yeah, I just actually can't read from this far. By the way, if you've ever noticed me squinting into the distance, it's me desperately trying to read the screen. But yeah, so anyway, so what are the lessons we learned from Censor? Well, we're still learning them, to be honest, but it's that cards with cards that fit in the format but that are often underwhelming can be really difficult to evaluate. You know, the Censor is definitely playable in some decks.
Yeah, like it has really good upside, but also pretty big downside. And the average case is like, you know, it's fine.
Yeah, but very hard to evaluate. And so we're still working out where we fall on Censor and ultimately figuring out how many decks actually want it and can afford to sort of deal with the low end of its use cases is ultimately going to determine how much of a staple it is versus a card that's just playable in some decks. Moving on, Jared, do you want to talk about a hit, a miss? What do you want to talk about?
Let's go back to another miss.
All right, what do
keep the cycle going.
you can choose this time.
All right, this time we're going to go onto almost a whole mechanic that the community missed on. We're going to represent it with a card to start, Palace Jailer and the Monarch mechanic. So this was printed in Conspiracy 2. Palace Jailer is 2 white for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. We'll touch on that in a minute. When Palace Jailer enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until an opponent becomes the Monarch. So now we'll go on to the Monarch. The Monarch reads, at the beginning of your end step, if you are the Monarch, draw a card. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, its controller becomes the Monarch. So the reason Palace Jailer in particular is so powerful, and I think it was pretty easy to mis-evaluate this card, is because most other Fiend Hunter-esque effects, or Faceless Butcher effects if you want to go OG.
Real deep, yeah.
Are until that creature leaves the battlefield. And creatures turn out to be a lot harder to deal with for some decks than the Monarchy.
Or easier to deal with than the Monarchy.
Sorry, easier than the Monarchy. And so against control decks in particular, if you're able to land a creature with the Monarch, it becomes incredibly difficult for the control deck to win the game. Yeah. Because you're drawing an extra card a turn, and their deck just isn't at all set up to steal it back.
Yeah, they have to fundamentally distort the way they play the game.
Yeah, and like against other decks, like if you get ahead on mana and therefore ahead on board, and then play the Monarchy, it just snowballs. It's like one of the most snowbally mechanics in Magic, because you then start drawing 2 cards a turn. Chances are you're going to play at least 1 spell a turn. You're already ahead on board, so you might start playing 2 spells a turn ahead of your opponent. Your 2 spells a turn are being fueled by the Monarchy, and you just get to keep bombarding them with the cards and advantage you already had, and it just keeps rolling on top of itself.
And I think one thing with Palace Jailer in particular that a lot of people missed in their evaluations is that they looked at it like a Fiend Hunter. They looked at it and thought it read stays exiled. You become the Monarch and then stays exiled until Palace Jailer leaves, and then whatever, it's fine.
Lots of people still represent that, because the traditional way to represent Fiend Hunter is to exile the creature under the Fiend Hunter, and then so like, all right, cool, once I get rid of this Fiend Hunter, I get my creature back. But whenever I see somebody do that, I take the creature out from under the Palace Jailer and put it under the Monarch token instead.
Yeah.
Because, like, I've seen people mess
Yeah.
it up lots. They're like, all right, kill your Palace Jailer, get my thing back. I'm like, no,
No, you do not.
you do not.
And what makes it particularly insane is you can like flicker the Palace Jailer to get more than one creature. There's just like
You can block and recur the Palace Jailer.
yeah, there's a bunch of really gross stuff you can do.
And so it turns out, so they designed the Monarch mechanic for multiplayer Magic, where it's much easier for it to get passed around because it's hard to commit to blocking everyone's creatures forever. Chances are someone's going to be able to hit you.
Yeah.
But it turns out in one-on-one Magic, when one deck isn't necessarily designed to attack very often, getting the Monarchy is just super, super good. And it turns out that in one-on-one Magic, almost any card that has the Monarchy is playable. Like, I've seen Thorn of the Black Rose played.
Yeah, that's just a 1/3 death touch for 4.
Yeah, I've seen Keeper of Keys is a super underrated one. That's 3 blue for a 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you're the Monarch, creatures you control can't be blocked this turn. So it's like a 5-mana 4/4, that's fine. It basically draws you a card when it enters the battlefield, because chances are they're not taking the Monarch from you the turn you play it. If you keep the Monarchy for a turn, your creatures are unblockable.
Yeah, it's very, very good in the Prowl deck. It's a rogue. It's a human rogue mutant too, actually.
All right.
There's not many
Yeah.
mutant tribal cards, but
So I think this card is super
undervalued. Yeah.
undervalued, yeah. Regal Behemoth is a card I recently started playing a lot. This one's 4 green for a 5/5 trampler. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. And whenever you tap a land for mana while you're the Monarch, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. I've played this card on stream and used it to good effect. I've played it in multiple different decks. It's been very good. I've seen several people playing Skyline Despot, which is...
I don't even know this one.
It's a 5 red for a 5/5 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you're the Monarch, put a 5/5 flying red dragon creature with the creature token with flying onto the battlefield.
Holy.
So if you keep the Monarch for 1 turn, it just starts multiplying. So it's just like all these cards are just even better at snowballing the Monarch mechanic.
Yeah. And so when we were talking about the sort of 3 categories, I think the one that maybe caused us to miss this card the most is the speed of the format. I think we looked at all these 4, 5, 6, and 7 drops and kind of ruled them out because they were expensive.
Yeah, well, and it's easy to rule out cards from a supplemental set that are designed for multiplayer. We're just like, all right, these cards aren't for us. That's fine. You know, carry on. But I agree. It turns out when you're casting these cards ahead of schedule or your deck is designed to elongate the games, that...
I mean, even Palace Jailer on 4, it turns out, is just a powerful enough effect on 4 because it affects the board and also gets you ahead, right? Like
Yeah. I actually think this is the most Eldritch Evolution 4 card in the format.
Maybe. It's a very good card to Evo for.
Yeah.
And then so when we're talking about lessons to learn from missing this, what the couple of things that made this particularly hard to evaluate is it's a brand new mechanic. And so it's going to be harder to evaluate new mechanics, and they just require more testing. And I think that this is maybe the next thing we'd say, and it, you'll find if you ask me on Twitter whether you should play a card, I almost always say yes, unless it's not very good. Even then, I sometimes say yes. And the reason is, we can talk about all this theoretical methodology for evaluating whether a card's good or not, but like when we're talking about average case, best case, worst case, I mean, we're not supercomputers, right? We're not Deep Blue. We can't go through and figure out what every possible interaction with this card is.
Yeah.
And you can do that in a much more efficient way by playing it. And so you should try things. And it wasn't until someone tried Palace Jailer that they went, oh God, wait, that it doesn't get removed when this dies? Wait, you have to become the Monarch to get this back? Like,
Then they played it against a control deck, and the control deck was just like,
yeah, conceded on the spot.
No.
Yeah, there was a stretch there where I was playing Throne of the High City in literally every deck, bar none, because it was just so good against control. So Throne is just a land that for 4 mana you can sacrifice and become the Monarch. It's just better Library of Alexandria against control decks. Like, because the game's gonna go long, you get to play out your cards.
Debatable.
Yeah.
Jury's still out on that one.
You heard it here first. Throne of the High City, better Library of Alexandria. Get them while they're hot. Soon they'll be the same price.
Hashtag not MTG Finance, even though Altar of Bone spiked.
Yeah, whoops.
Did you hear that, Graham?
Wait, what?
Yeah. So on the last show, you were like, oh yeah, Altar of Bone, reserve list.
Look at the price now.
Wait, why is it $15?
No, that's not even what it spiked to. It spiked to 43.
Excuse me?
Yeah. It was 3 the other day.
Yeah.
Last week.
I was talking about how this card, if there was a card I was going to go in on, this was the one.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, what the...
Whoops.
I'm looking at the trend list, and yeah, there's a real spike on that graph.
Correct.
Yes.
Neat.
But yeah, so anyway, the first thing is that evaluating a new mechanic is difficult. So especially with new mechanics, you should just try cards because you just don't know. Sorry, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, another thing you don't want to get bogged down in is just looking at worst case, which is I think another thing people looked at when they looked at the Monarch mechanic. They're like, oh, you're just gonna play one of these cards, they're gonna kill it, they're gonna take the Monarch, and then you just played a card that let them draw a card forever.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take into account the average case and the best case as well. Like, it's easy to look at a mechanic like this and see the big potential downsides, but as Liam says, you have to test it and see what the average case is, not just the best and worst case.
Yep. And then the last one is, so we talked about format speed, we talked about like evaluating best and worst case. In terms of like actual decks this went in, I think this is actually the thing we did the best with this card, is that people worked out like, hey, these white weenie strategies, quite good with Palace Jailer. Interestingly, the pod decks play Palace Jailer because it's a nice dual utility card. It can both remove an annoying threat and also is very effective against control decks as a way to beat up on them.
Yeah. Basically, any white-based creature deck is now playing Palace Jailer. Like, you often saw it in Jeskai for a while.
Yep.
That's just a deck that's very good at like controlling the board and then flipping the switch very quickly from sort of reactive deck to proactive deck.
Yep. So the lessons to be learned, we should try things more often, especially new mechanics, try new mechanics. But, and then the last thing I was going to say is that the power and toughness of this card, I think, turned a lot of people off too. It being a 4-mana 2/2 made a lot of people tune out and not read the line of text that happened afterwards. Just like
there were just enough things to turn you off the card that made you not want to test it. But literally as soon as anyone tested this card, they were like, oh yeah, this card's busted.
Just busted.
Yeah.
So let's go from a card that we definitely missed on from a supplemental set to a card from a supplemental set that we did not miss on. Let's say.
No,
and
not as such.
And we'll be a little shorter on these ones that we nailed because, frankly, like it's obvious we nailed them.
Yeah,
these cards are good.
There's a little less to talk about, but it's important to still touch on the reasons that these cards are staples and why we were able to identify them as such, like almost immediately.
Yeah. So the card we're talking about now is Leovold, Emissary of Trest. So this is Bug, black, green, blue. Oh, I even got the order right. Sick. For a legendary creature, Elf Advisor. Oh, it goes in the Azorius. What's that? Elocutors deck. Perfect.
Azor's Elocutors?
Azorius Elocutors or whatever it is.
It's Azor's.
Is it Azor's?
Yes.
Huh. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh boy, did I try to win some standard games with this card.
Yeah. So anyway, Advisor Tribal coming to a house near you soon. So this card is a 3/3. It says each opponent can't draw more than one card each turn. Whenever you or a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card.
So it'll take you a few read-throughs to, if you haven't read this card before or haven't seen it played, to fully comprehend everything this card does, because I think everyone I talked to within the first week of seeing this card like missed something. Like a lot of
but
people
still thought it was good.
Yeah, everyone thought it was nuts, but everyone was missing a part. Like one person I talked to just like completely ignored the top ability. They're just like, yeah, like whenever they target you or a permanent you control, and I was like, permanent? I thought it was just me.
Yeah.
And then somebody else was like, yeah, spell. And I'm like, yeah, or ability. And they're like, ability? They wasteland me, I draw a card. They Rashad import me, I draw.
Yeah.
It's just like,
yeah.
everything put together in this card just is
Yeah.
such a house.
And so, yeah, so when we're talking about how does it fit into the power level of the format, it's just insane, right? Against the very interactive decks, it's going to grind card advantage. Against the combo decks, it's probably going to disrupt them by not letting them draw extra cards.
Sometimes just hold them.
Yeah, it's at its worst against maybe like the aggressive creature decks, and even then it's a 3-mana 3/3, which is like...
Which is also potentially drawing you cards to help you find the card you need to
like
dig your way to the
so it's just
situation.
good in every matchup. In terms of existing decks that it fits in, if you had 2 of the 3 colors, you were adding the third one to fit this in some instances.
Often.
Like if you were blue-green, you were putting Bayou and Underground Sea in your deck to play Leovold. If you were black-green, you were adding Underground Sea and Tropical Island to play Leovold. If you were 4-color pod, you were 5-color pod now. Or if you were just already playing a bug deck, life was good. You just got to put this card in.
Yeah, you're just like...
But
oh,
basically,
boy.
anything that
Put it in.
can remotely close to touch the mana cost to play this card was going to try to. It's green, so it's tutorable by like cards like Green Sun Zenith, which is like just absolutely abusive.
Yeah.
And then, so it fits into the format really
I think
effectively.
this might be the most Green Sun 4 card now.
Maybe. It's a very good one. I did see it in someone's Flash Hulk deck the other day. They were Flash Hulking for this.
I did as well. That's a little questionable. I'm not sure you need to go that far.
They went Flash Hulk, get this plus Spellseeker.
Yeah.
Like after doing some other looping, but they passed the turn with their final action being get this plus Spellseeker.
That seems maybe a touch unnecessary. In Flash Hulk, I prefer to just kill them.
Well, so, yeah, you know what?
That's
We won't talk about the
to
problem.
To each their own.
They were playing not Mog Fanatic, and so they couldn't kill Gideon of the Trials.
Well, that just seems like poor deck building.
That's fine. There's definitely reasons to do both. Anyway,
Yeah, there's pros and cons.
I digress. So this card fits in the speed of the format. It fits in existing decks, and then
The worst case basically doesn't exist.
yeah, like the worst case is that it gets countered, I guess. But you could say that about literally every card ever, other than like
I guess the
uncounterable.
worst case is its mana cost, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
like
The
a
worst
little
case is
hard
that it's
to cast.
uncastable. That's fair. But its best case is so good that it negates the thought of that that worst
And
case.
even the average case of this card, if this card is in play, you feel like you're winning.
Yes.
Every time,
Definitely.
almost regardless of what the game state is.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there's not that many lessons to take away from this card, but the things to look at are it's really good at all points in the game. It's really good against basically everyone. And it just fit into a bunch of decks, even though it's really mana intensive. It was just worth stretching your
and
mana to play.
One notable thing in Highlander is that like this would actually be harder to cast as like black green, like or green black.
Yes.
Green black's maybe a little easier because you have elf,
Yeah, but if it was black blue or black green or something.
yeah, that makes it that would actually be harder to cast than just bug.
Yep. Yeah, one of each color, easier to get than multiples of some.
Yeah. All right. Do we want to do another?
I want to do a maybe, and then I want to talk about one more that we missed on because I think it's a good one to talk about.
Let's talk about the. We're gonna group these two maybes together.
Sure,
the
sounds good.
Community was very divided on them for a while. Actually, almost all of Magic was divided on them at some point.
Still.
It quickly diverged, but
Yeah, people are still divided on them.
we're talking about Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, the
To draw delve spells.
colossal mistakes from Cons of Tarkir.
I mean, they're only banned in 6 formats. Banned or restricted, I guess you would say.
Yeah,
Combined between the two of them.
sure. They're both banned.
Modern, Vintage, Restricted, and Legacy.
Yes. Other way around. Banned in Legacy.
Banned in
restricted
Legacy,
Vintage.
Restricted, and Vintage, yes.
Yes. They're also both banned in 1v1 Commander, if you care, and Treasure Cruise is banned in Pauper.
Right, makes sense. Logical. They're banned in a lot of formats.
They're pretty good.
Above average.
Leopold, by the way, is banned in normal Commander
Yeah,
because it's just too annoying.
that doesn't sound very fun.
No. And yet Atraxa. But I digress. Carry on.
All right, the Commander podcast coming soon, featuring Graham Stark and Graham Stark. So Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time were tough to evaluate for some people.
Do we want to go over what they do? Just
Oh
in
yeah,
case
sure. We
our-
can talk about it really quick. So Dig Through Time is 6 blue for an instant with Delve. Delve lets you exile cards from your graveyard to help pay the generic portion of the mana cost. So if you exile 6 cards from your graveyard, Delve only costs blue. The text is look at the top 7 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Treasure Cruise is 7 blue with Delve, and it says draw 3 cards. So the issue with these cards was that Khans of Tarkir was the return of Delve, and there hadn't been that many Delve cards previously. Tombstalker and Logic Knot were both
the only ones that saw any play whatsoever.
right,
And
and they were reasonable. They were fine.
They weren't staples by any means, though. Logic Knot saw play in most blue counterspell decks, but not all. And if they weren't playing it, you weren't like, you're not playing Logic Knot, you're crazy.
Yeah.
No, you were like, yeah, you could maybe fit it in, but that's okay. And Tombstalker didn't actually see that much play. I think it was, and probably still is, a pretty underrepresented threat in the format.
Yep.
But
And so that's part one, is that Delve was basically new and really hard to evaluate.
yes.
Obviously, cost-reducing mechanics should always send up red flags, and this was no exception. Ultimately, though, it's nuts. Filling your graveyard's very easy, and so when we're talking about the speed of the format, these fit in the speed of the format. You're gonna get 6 and 7 cards in your graveyard. You're gonna be able to cast these on a reasonable time frame.
Especially in formats with fetch lands, with all the 1-mana cantrips legal. Like, I've cast Dig Through Time for 2 blue on turn 3. You can play Thought Scour and Mental Note in your deck. You can play fetch lands.
Yeah,
You can play
it's totally
Ponder,
doable.
Preordain, Gitaxian Probe.
Yeah.
So many ways to get cards into your... Like, you actively want to be interacting with your opponent as much as possible in the first 2 turns anyways, and then you just get to pull ahead with either of these cards, and you feel invincible.
So it fits in the speed of the format. Some people were unsure whether it would or not, and that's where part of the debate came from.
That's where most of the debate came from, whereas they argued that if you saw this card in your opening hand,
It was a mulligan.
it was a mulligan.
In
But-
practice, it's not.
Yeah, in practice, it quickly turned out that seeing these cards in your opening hand was sometimes bad. Sometimes it just led to having a super clunky draw. Like if you had either of these cards, like
I mean, the
3
real
lands.
problem comes with when you get both.
Yeah, drawing both is not very good. They certainly do tax your graveyard as well, which
It's not irrelevant.
yeah, like you want to play other cards that tax graveyards, like you want to play Scavenging Ooze, you want to play Deathrite Shaman, you want to play Tarmogoyf, where you want cards in the graveyard, you want to play Snapcaster Mage.
Yeah.
There are other Delve cards, mostly from Khans of Tarkir, like Murderous Cut, Tassiger, Gurmag Angler. Those cards are all graveyard taxing as well. So I think the hardest issue was like how many of these can you play and how good are they really, especially in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, and so no one had a hard time figuring out what decks these went in, which was blue decks. If you had blue in your deck, you were going to try and play them.
I actually think people did.
Oh, really?
Up until a point. Like, people just played them in traditional blue decks where you wanted to draw cards, but I actually think you were the one who played Bant aggro with both these cards, right? Or did
Yeah.
you just play Treasure Cruise?
No, I played both.
Yeah, and you just like crushed a tournament because people were wrathing you, and then you were like, all right, Treasure Cruise for 1 mana, draw 3 more threats, play 3 more threats, and they're just like, oh god, like, I
Yeah.
don't have that many wraths, and you were just like
Yeah.
out card advantaging people who were 3-for-1ing you.
Yeah, and with Treasure Cruise in particular, this is the card that gets banned first a lot of the time. Got banned first in most of the formats.
Yeah.
It's just so splashable. You can play it so easily in so many decks, and I think that was ultimately part of it. So when it comes down to why these cards were so hard to evaluate, it's that it took a lot of testing to work out where that range of average case actually was. And once people discovered, hey, the average cases of these are Ancestral Recall, and there's not actually an analogous card for Dig Through Time, but
No.
Dig Through Time was castable on turn 3 or 4 fairly routinely and was nuts, right? Like getting to see 7 deep and
especially
getting 2.
in 100-card Singleton, the base blue decks would actually prefer to have Dig Through Time in their deck over Treasure Cruise. The fact that it was an instant, and in 100-card Singleton, hitting 2 of the top 7 is quite often better than just 3
Just
randoms.
3 randoms, yeah. So ultimately, once we got more in tune with what the average use case was for these cards was, people started realizing, hey, these cards are insane, and ultimately they did both become pointed. for exactly this reason. They just weren't fair to have it 0 anymore. But that took a long time, you know. Treasure Cruise took almost 9 months to get pointed, I think.
Yeah, we were both on the council when.
Yeah, I was only on the council for Treasure Cruise getting pointed. I don't even think I was there when Dig Through Time.
I don't think you were.
I think I'd left at that point.
It definitely took some battling to get these cards on the points list.
And that's a different discussion. But by that time, people had at least recognized that they were extremely powerful.
Yeah, and last year, so 2017, Dig Through Time was actually the winningest pointed card.
Yeah.
It was in the most
winning decks.
Winning decks.
Yeah. In Victoria, obviously.
Yeah.
So what can we take away from these cards? Well, the two big things are, once again, new mechanics, hard to evaluate, need to be tested. So similar to Monarch, actually, I think that the big blue delve spells were an exposition, expedition into this kind of problem of there's a new expedition is the word I was looking for, into evaluating new mechanics. And then secondly, actually figuring out how powerful they were was more difficult than I think people thought they were. And lastly, figuring out how splashable they actually were, or how powerful these effects were in maybe unconventional strategies was very important.
I think that's the biggest one for me, is the sort of most underlooked sort of evaluation rubric. Piece of the evaluation rubric is like, how usable are these cards across different archetypes, like we talked about it earlier. And these cards are just like so useful in literally every deck that can cast them. Like literally every deck wants access to more resources. Like you could add 0, like they were getting played in combo decks, mid-range decks, control decks, aggro decks, like prison decks played them.
Yep.
Like literally any deck that could cast these cards was playing them at 0 points.
Yeah. So very good. We're going to talk about one more card that we missed on before we go to the end of the show, just because it kind of highlights a different problem that we haven't really talked about yet. So this card is Felidar Guardian. So this is 3 and a white for a cat guardian? Beast. Why isn't it a guardian? Oh. When Felidar Guardian enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control, so it basically flickers something. It's a 1/4, and it costs 5 mana. So this was obviously the scourge of Standard. It got Saheeli Rai banned in Standard, or
it got banned in Standard.
It got banned in Standard. Sorry, but it plus Saheeli Rai was the reason.
Yeah.
That sort of combo. But actually, when this card got spoiled, we completely missed it as the Highlander community, and the reason why people missed it is I think most people looked at it in 2 different contexts. They looked at it as a 4-mana Worst Restoration Angel, like a 4-mana sorcery speed.
I think that's how 90% of people saw it.
Yeah, like a sort of 4-mana sorcery speed, flicker something that leaves behind a 1/4, which is not playable. Or they looked at it as a combo piece with Saheeli Rai, and they said, well, this 3-mana Planeswalker, by the way, for those of you who don't know how this combo works, Saheeli Rai is a 3-mana Planeswalker for 1 blue-red, who has 3 abilities. The +1 is scry 1 and deal 1 damage to each opponent. The -2, and this is the important one, is create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. That token gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. And then the -7 is search your library for up to 3 artifact cards with different names and put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So the important one is the -2 here. With Felidar Guardian plus Saheeli Rai, you can make infinite cats because you -2 on a cat. It flickers Saheeli. Saheeli has to live through the -2, but it flickers Saheeli, and then since it's a new Saheeli, you can use the ability again. You make many cat guardians and yeah, kill them with your feline fury. But so Saheeli Rai is also not an especially playable card in Highlander.
No.
It's okay, but certainly wasn't something that people were blown away by, and that card already existed. And so what people missed, so in speed of the format, it didn't feel like it fit, or it didn't feel like it fit better than other things. In terms of best use case, it felt like, I don't know, you flicker your kitchen finks, or...
Yeah, well, the best case is obviously in the combo.
In the combo, sure.
But I think the problem was the average and worst case both looked kind of meh.
Yeah,
like,
very bad.
If you had a thing to flicker, it's like, sure, you got to reset a kitchen finks, and now you have a 1/4 that's pretty good against aggro, but like it's not game winning.
Yeah.
And like if you just like top deck a 4-drop, you want it to be somewhat impactful on an empty board, and this just is not remotely.
No, like the worst case was like you play it and you flicker to land, so it only costs 3 instead of 4.
Yeah.
And like that's just not good enough for a 1/4. So what people missed is when we were looking at this card, we didn't look at decks that already existed that wanted a card like this. And so the reason why this card is now, I mean, you could call it a staple. It's a staple in exactly one sort of brand of archetype, but is the way this card interacts with Kiki-Jiki, and more specifically, the way it interacts with Survival of the Fittest and Birthing Pod. So I've talked about this combo before, but with Felidar Guardian and Survival of the Fittest and 3 green mana, you can kill your opponent on the next turn, as long as you have 3 and 2 white. So what you can do is you can survival away a card, get Felidar Guardian, survival it away, get Kiki-Jiki, survival it away, get Karmic Guide. So that's your 3 green. Then on your next turn, you cast Karmic Guide, you get to, and Karmic Guide is 3 white for an angel, has protection from black, and when it enters the battlefield, you can bring a creature from your graveyard back into play. What you do is you pass Karmic Guide, get back Felidar Guardian flickers the Karmic Guide, which then enters the battlefield, gets back Kiki-Jiki, which is 2 red for the old legendary goblin,
Red.
which, yeah, 2 red, which is for a 2-mana legendary, or 2/2 legendary goblin.
Shaman.
Shaman, yeah, it goes in the Shaman's deck. With haste, that can tap to create a token that's a copy of target non-legendary creature you control. That token gets haste, sacrifices being ends up, yada yada yada. Felidar Guardian plus Kiki-Jiki is infinite, so you kill them. So what that means is that this really upgraded how powerful Survival of the Fittest was.
And the reason it didn't work before is that Restoration Angel was basically used in place of Felidar Guardian, but Restoration Angel doesn't work in this line because Restoration Angel only blinks non-angel creatures, and Karmic Guide is an angel. So it's a really subtle thing, but this line actually wasn't accessible to the decks that only played Restoration Angel
And
previously.
so you had to have two creatures. If you had 2 creatures, you could just go get Restoration Angel, cast it on the end step, go get Kiki-Jiki, cast Kiki-Jiki.
Exactly.
But now you can just do it all with 1 card, and most importantly, you don't have to cast Kiki-Jiki. You get to cast a 2 white or 3 white spell instead of a triple pipped red spell. Then maybe more significantly is it's the role it plays in the pod line, which is you can now take any 3-drop, or if you're a blue deck, any 4-drop or any 2-drop, and just win the game on the spot. And so the reason that works is that you can pod a 3-drop into Felidar Guardian. Felidar Guardian flickers the pod. You can pod the Birthing Pod is 3 and a Phyrexian green mana for an artifact that for 1 and a green Phyrexian mana, which can be paid with either 2 life or green, that lets you sacrifice a creature, search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature's converted mana cost, and then you put that onto the battlefield and you shuffle your library afterwards. So you can pod your 3-drop into Felidar Guardian, flicker the pod. Then you can pod the Felidar Guardian into Karmic Guide, get back the Felidar Guardian, and then you flicker the pod again. Then you pod the Felidar Guardian again, and you get Kiki-Jiki, and you copy the Karmic Guide with Kiki-Jiki, get back the Felidar Guardian, and now you have Felidar Guardian plus Kiki-Jiki, and you infinitely kill your opponent. And so this is what we missed. We missed that the best case for Felidar Guardian is that it drastically upgrades 2 cards that were already pretty good and that you wanted to play in your deck anyway. And this is one of the things that really pushed the pod deck from being a tier 1.5 archetype to a tier 1 archetype.
Yeah, just the ease of the ways to end the game when you get your marquee cards in the deck. Just like, yeah, I think
it was just sort of so obscenely powerful. And I think we correctly evaluated that the card is not good on its own. We correctly evaluated that it didn't fit in the speed of the format. What we missed was how well it fit into an existing deck, and that was the real lesson to be learned. There was, we have to look to as many places as we can and try and think of as many interactions as possible. This was a good one. It's funny that I played this in a in a deck that wasn't casting Kiki-Jiki. I was playing Abzan Pod, and I thought of this combo, and I was like, that's got to be great. I'm gonna put Kiki-Jiki in my deck that can't even cast it. And then
it was great.
It was pretty good, but it was even better in the deck that could sincerely cast Kiki-Jiki.
Yeah, you could argue that deck was just better than your iteration.
Certainly was.
If you're wondering why Felidar Guardian is not subtype Guardian, because there is no longer a Guardian subtype.
Huh. There was at one point?
Well, back when everything was just summon this thing, there were 3 Guardians.
Right.
Was Guardian Beast one of them?
No. They were, I had this, Luminous Guardian, which is now a human nomad. Hydromorph Guardian.
Holy moly.
Which is now an elemental. And, and Hydromorph Gull, which is now an elemental bird, but was a bird guardian.
What a loss.
So
Truly.
now
Racing
you,
history.
Now you know.
Fair enough. But yeah, so that's a card we missed on, and I think it's an interesting sort of like demonstration of the fact that we sometimes just don't see everything. You know, you don't think of every interaction, or right when a card gets spoiled, the sort of Highlander hive mind doesn't necessarily see it. And in particular, this was a card that, you know, that interaction isn't going to come up in Modern because Pod's banned. It's not going to come up in Legacy because Survival's banned, and it's too expensive for Legacy, to be fair. So it was just
the pod decks in Legacy aren't really super combo either.
no, not at all. So yeah, so this was just not something we were gonna get from outside, and it was just something that the Highlander community is small enough that it just took a little while for it to come out, for people to start playing it. So, but that's it for our show today. Well, at least that's it for the first part. We're still gonna do our closing segment, of course, which is powerful magic. On for powerful magic is today. It's me.
I didn't get to double down.
No, you do not.
No double dip?
I'm doing the secondary segment that we often do towards the end of the back half of the show.
Tough but fair.
Yeah. So the story does involve you though, for this particular.
Great.
Yeah, it's quite recent actually. So last week we talked about Flash Hulk, and Flash Hulk recently had a point taken off it because Worldly Tutor's 0 again. So I
voted against it. Worldly to 1.
So those of you who have watched me play on stream before, on this stream, will know I like playing combo decks. So I sleeved up Flash Hulk for the tournament Thursday, and Jared and I get paired in round 2. In round 1, I successfully defeated 200 card Jeskai.
A truly monumentous feat.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone defeated him that day.
Such all-stars as Swiftwater Cliffs making an appearance.
The best part was that
Pauper
he was playing 200 card Jeskai in order to get 20 points, but he actually forgot to put one of the pointed cards in. So he was playing 200 card Jeskai with 19 points. He forgot to put the True Name Nemesis in his deck, was playing Aerial Responder instead. For those of you keeping track at home, Aerial Responder considerably worse than True Name Nemesis.
Not the worst, but
it's not sure isn't True Name. So Jared and I get paired in round 2. We're both 1-0, and Jared knows what deck I'm on, and he quite politely didn't put Fairy Macabre in his deck, which he could have.
I was going to. I was playing really fair black-green graveyard value.
Yeah, and so in game 1, Jared thought seizes me on turn 1. I'm on the play, so I play.
No, it's turn 2.
Was it turn 2 you thought seized me?
Yep.
I thought it was turn 1. I thought it was your turn 1, and I was on the play.
It was turn 2.
All right, anyway, so Jared thought seizes me on turn 2. He takes the Yellow Domry's Call out of my hand, and I have no other combo pieces and no other...
He has a Trinket Mage and a Remand.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And some lands.
So anyway, so I play a land and say go. Then Jared taps out for a Grim Flare. I remand it. I draw Flash. And then I draw for my turn. I draw Serum Visions. And then I cast Serum Visions, and I draw Hulk. And then I kill him with Flash Hulk after he thought seized me the turn before. Yeah.
True story.
So that's game 1. And you'd think, well, surely this match is over. You know, Jared.
Yeah, so just to put it into perspective, I thought seize him, take literally the only relevant card out of his hand, and I'm like, oh man, this is so great. I went from like I'm never winning to like, oh my god, I might win, and then you just like 2 out of 3s me in this next.
It's 2 out of 4. 2 out of 4. I saw 4 cards. But
was it? Did you?
Yeah,
Remand,
draw step, Serum Visions. Oh yeah, I guess it was 3. No, because you thought seize me, and then it was my turn 4 that I did this. I had 2 draw steps.
All right.
I did draw step the turn. I didn't play the remand.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was not especially fair. Then in game 2, I have a grindstone in play. Jared has lethal on board, but I've cast a Worldly Tutor on my end step, and
no, in response to I was duressing you
or something. Yeah, I hand attack spell, but it was the only card in my hand that mattered.
Yeah.
So I cast it. I'm like looking through my deck, and I'm like, oh crap, you know, he's playing this like graveyard deck because you'd play like Vessel of Nascency or something. So
I sure had.
So I thought, you know, oh, new Emerald's obviously in his deck.
It sure was.
And somehow tricked myself into thinking Emrakul the Promised End had the old Eldrazi text where it would shuffle itself back into his deck if it
Sure
was milled.
doesn't.
And Painter Servant Grindstone is in this deck, this Flash Hulk deck. And so I'm like looking at this Worldly Tutor, and I'm like, Painter Servant doesn't win. What a shame. That's really frustrating. And then I'm like trying to decide, like, oh, maybe I should do it just to like make sure that's the case. No, whatever. So instead, I end up going for this line where I like put Hulk on top of my deck,
Grindstone
myself, and then hope to draw Necromancy to win the game. I did not. And then after the game, I'm like, oh yeah, I couldn't go for Painter Servant because your Emrakul will just shuffle back in, and Jarrett's like, no, that's not how that works.
Yeah, I like wasn't gonna say anything, but then I'm like, yeah, that's not how that works.
And
then
so,
Liam's like, no, all the new Eldrazi, they shuffle in, and I'm like, none of them do, and he's like, so I like show him the
showed me the text.
Show him the Oracle text, and he's like, definitely could have just won that game, and I'm like,
so you'd think, well, that's embarrassing, but whatever. So then in the next game, I cast Grindstone on turn 1, and then the game was almost exactly the same. You had a Thoughtseize and a Grimflare in all 3 games. You mulliganed a bunch. You selectively mulliganed to these kinds of hands. I'm not suggesting.
I think I mulliganed to 5 twice.
You did, yeah. And then in the third game, I, with 4 lands in play at a Grindstone, cast Worldly Tutor, and this time did not have to go get Hulk.
You saw the line.
I found the line by virtue of my good friend Jeremy. So it was a weird match. There was some bizarre stuff going on.
I just wanted to play some good, clean graveyard Magic, and I play against Academy and Flash Hulk. I think I mulliganed like maybe 15.
Didn't you beat Academy though?
Yeah, but it wasn't fun. I mulliganed like 15 times in 2 matches, just because I'm like, well, I have like 5 relevant cards.
I saw you ult a Liliana the Veil against Nick on like turn 6 or something in the Academy matchup. You had like Mox Lily.
It was later than turn 6 for sure, but yeah, I ulted it to kill like an Academy and another land. He wasn't doing much.
No.
But.
So anyway, that's my story for this week. It's recent, so it was in my head. Less powerful and more floundering on my case, and very lucky.
It illustrated the power of your deck.
That's true. Yes, I am.
If your opponent isn't planning to interact with you on a meaningful axis, that deck just it's sometimes just hard to lose.
Yep. So that's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed following along as we talked about card evaluation, all that kind of stuff. A quick reminder that Jared and I will be at the Card Kingdom Highlander tournament Saturday, 23rd or whatever it is.
So is Alex, actually.
Oh, is he also going?
Yeah, coming out of
retirement.
Vacation retirement.
I see. So, if you see us there, please don't hesitate to say hi. We'll happily say hi as well. But yeah, other than that, we want to thank the Patreon again, as we always do. Without your support, we couldn't do anything. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next week, hopefully with Serge and Tail.